Okay, we're going to try again. I think we have sound. Excellent. I can hear myself twice. Well, I'll just repeat a little bit of what I said before about the housekeeping side of things. The lecture is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. And for those at home, please make sure that your mics are muted, and it might be best to turn off your own video for the duration. If you would like to ask any questions, please type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screens, and we can go through them at the end of the lecture. And for those of you that are here with us, please ensure your mobiles are silent. And of course, you can ask questions at the end too. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Owen Parkinson. Owen specializes in Central Mediterranean prehistory and the analysis of human remains and funerary evidence. He received a first-class degree in archaeology at Queen's University, Belfast in 2013, receiving the Kerr Prize for Best Final Year Performance and the Kerr Dissertation Prize for Best Final Year Dissertation. As an undergraduate, he undertook an Erasmus exchange at the University of Malta, which allowed him to engage with the Maltese archaeological community, an experience which has entirely shaped why and how he has chosen to pursue his career in archaeology. Following his undergraduate degree, Owen completed his MSc in Human Osteology and Funerary Archaeology at the University of Sheffield. He was awarded a distinction on his thesis, Joint Articulation in Resolving Commingled Human Remains, Osteometric Analysis of the Acetabulo-femoral and tibio-femoral articular surface areas. Oh, it took a while to do that one. It was followed by a PhD exploring the impact of social and economic change on the human body across 5,000 years of Italian prehistory through scientific analysis of archaeological human remains. After his PhD, Owen held the Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, British School at Rome, postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Cambridge, during which he also was a fellow of the MacDonald Institute of Archaeological Research and a research associate at St John's College, Cambridge. He returned to QUB as a postgraduate research assistant on the Fraxus project, which investigated the fragility and sustainability of prehistoric mortar, and completed a Leverhulme Trust-funded postdoctoral research position at the University of Malta's Department of Classics and Archaeology. He can't possibly have any more interest than that, but he does. His interests include megalithic Europe, funerary archaeology, and paleoeconomy. He's also an active field archaeologist and has been involved in projects in Italy and Sardinia, Malta, France, Croatia, Iraqi Kurdistan, and Ireland. And he's currently a lecturer in prehistoric archaeology here at Queen's. So please welcome Dr. Owen Parkinson, who is going to talk about lesser spotted Europe, a bioarchaeological approach to early farming lifestyles in Southern Europe. Owen.
Okay, super duper. The first thing I'd like to just note that I do have a stutter that sometimes causes me to have breaks in my speech. So please bear with me on that. And if anything I say isn't clear as a result of that, please just raise your hand, both in the room or online. And somebody can let me know if I need to clarify anything. So yes, I'm Owen Parkinson, and I've just returned to Queen's. And what I'm talking about today is, I guess, kind of work that goes back a couple of years. It builds upon my PhD work and talks about the directions that I've tried to take it in the years since. And really, in the next few months at Queen's, it's my real aim to try to develop some of what I'll be talking about today, which is very much a work in progress. The title, Lesser Spotted Europe, Bioarchaeological Approach to Early Farming Lifestyles in the South of Europe. Again, whenever I was asked to give this lecture, I was watching a bit of Joe Mahan on the TV, and that's for it. And I didn't really know what to really title the lecture, but again, I was watching a bit of Joe Mahan, watching a bit of Lesser Spotted Ulster, and I thought about how the work that I do really is kind of in this part of Europe that is very much neglected. So that's where the title comes from. And I'm really interested in really what the impact of social and economic change was on the human body in prehistory, and how we can use archaeological science to try to understand that a bit. So, let's see. There we go. So over the course of the lecture, I want to first give a little bit of the archaeological context on the background. So I'm hoping that I can transport you from this very, very cold, horrible minus temperature here to the Mediterranean, where you might feel a little bit warmer, at least in mind, perhaps not in body. So give you a little bit of that archaeological context to the region. I want to talk a little bit about the methodological approach that I've used to try to understand some of these questions, the materials which I've been using, so those which were used in my doctoral research, and then how I've tried to build upon that. And then again, presenting some of these results, which are a work in progress. And I'll be talking about data relating to estimations of human body size, trying to understand physical behavior and habitual activity from the human skeleton, trying to reconstruct diet from the human skeleton, and also trying to understand population dynamics and the relationship between all of these things. So how they actually come together, and how we can have this very integrated understanding of the past. And then ending up with some concluding remarks, which again, bearing in mind that this is very much a work in progress, which kind of hopefully goes towards this integrated approach to understanding people in the past and some of the directions that I want to take this. So my kind of affair with the Mediterranean started 12 years ago, whenever I first went to Malta as an undergraduate student. And since then I've sort of moved into working in Italy quite a lot. And I really fell in love with this part of the world because I feel it's a part of the world where you have the entire European story in one peninsula. That is to say, we have some of the earliest lower Paleolithic sites in Europe on the Italian peninsula. We have some of the most famous Neanderthal sites. We have some of the earliest evidence for our species in Europe coming into the upper Paleolithic, all the way through to the development of proto-urbanism, early states, and then, of course, the Roman Empire, the very foundation of European society, of Western society. And with all of that, this part of the world is also very important for the transition to agriculture, the spread of agriculture across the Mediterranean region. And that is what I'll be talking about primarily today and what my real research interest is. But I'm also interested in long-term perspectives. So again, I'm interested in early farming societies, but I try to put that within the broader context of the story of us, of the story of our species. So I'll be talking about trends and data going from the upper Paleolithic really through to the modern period, about 100 years ago, all the while thinking about that crucial point of the transition to agriculture. So just a little bit of an overview. I mean, I'm sure that most people probably have a good handle on the story of Neolithic Europe, but just to kind of go over that. The Neolithic way of life spread into Europe through two main routeways. Coming out of Anatolia over into Greece, you had the spread of groups going up through the Balkans, up the Danube River, onto the Great Hungarian Plain, and then the genesis of the LBK culture, this overland terrestrial spread of the farming lifestyle in a really, really short period of time. The other sort of route of spread was across the northern coast of the Mediterranean. So this is really what I'll be talking about today. And by the time it gets to the Italian peninsula, you get basically the development of what are called impressed ware, what is called impressed ware pottery. And this again really typifies the spread of agriculture across the Mediterranean region. So it's really kind of from the Italian peninsula onwards that is really whenever this thing starts to get going. Now, whenever we think about what actually this meant in terms of the population structure of Neolithic Europe, this is a paper which I was lucky enough to be involved with with colleagues from Trinity College Dublin, Bruno Ariano and Dan Bradley and others. And this actually showed that again, how these different routeways actually have quite a major bearing on, again, the genetic and population structure. So you can see that actually there's a real marked distinction between early farmers on this overland continental route and the Mediterranean route. You can see here all of these Anatolians, so from what's modern day Turkey, Greece, the Balkans, and Central Europe. So all of these samples here cluster in very tightly together. Whereas whenever we look at the Mediterranean story, it's a much different thing, okay? We see that actually all of these Mediterranean samples are very, very far spread out. And they actually kind of almost fall into, their distribution almost falls in to basically their geographic location. And this again just shows again just how those two different routes again can have a real impact on people and on their actual very makeup. What we generally see is that these Mediterranean populations are much more spread out. And this again is really kind of an artifact of how the Neolithic way of life spreads, because it's all about the movement of these small pioneer groups jumping from coastal enclave to coastal enclave. And then you pretty much see this kind of genetic drift, well, not really genetic drift, but that kind of signal happening. So we basically see a much more spread out distribution. And the reason why I'm talking about this is to really drive home the point that the transition to agriculture is really a demographic transition. It's about people, it's about the movement of people, and it's about, again, booms in population. And this is something that's been very well looked at. And this here shows sort of an attempt at reconstructing population for Neolithic Europe. This comes again from a recent paper I was involved in with a colleague of mine, Rowan McLaughlin, and some other folks. And again, this sort of using radiocarbon data and looking at their density over time, you're able to then try to get at an estimation of population size. And you can see that with the transition to agriculture, in all these different parts of Europe, you see this big spike. Okay, so this big population boom and then bust. You see it, you know, in the south of France, in Scandinavia, in Britain, and Ireland. Okay, you pretty much see it everywhere. What's also really interesting, and again, tying into this notion of a demographic transition within the part of the world I'll be talking about today, the Mediterranean, we also see that these early farming groups are moving into areas that pretty much don't have any hunter-gatherers in them. So basically they're empty in most cases. What this publication here refers to as Snowmans Land. Okay, so these big red areas or light red areas are areas where these farming groups are moving in. They don't encounter any local indigenous hunter-gatherers. And whilst what's on the screen here is primarily using radiocarbon data to understand this process. Again, this is just really one nice way of trying to visualize these processes, but actually, you know, it's been shown at a genetic level. Genetic studies have shown again that there is a huge population increase with agriculture. It also sees complete genetic discontinuity with hunter-gatherer groups and Neolithic farming groups. So again, this is really a demographic transition. And this is one of the fundamental things of the transition to agriculture, really in any part of the world. Even today, in places where we see the transition to agriculture happening, again, it is really a demographic transition. I want to zoom in a little bit to talk about this process in the central Mediterranean. As really with the entire Mediterranean region, this is a dynamic process. It doesn't really happen in one nice, smooth, single wave. There's all these stops and starts and jumps and skips. And what we see is that from after sort of a kind of initial stall from the Balkans, we see then the first forming sites in the south of Italy by about 6,100 BC. By as early as what we think as early as 5,950 BC, we have pioneer farming groups way up in the north of Italy and in the south of France. By about 6,000 BC, we have them on they have them on Sicily, and also quite likely the Maltese Islands. In other parts of the region, we kind of see a bit of a different picture. We see, for example, in the Adriatic area, it's a much more slower and muted process. And this little image here shows it quite nicely. We can see this sort of spread of agriculture coming in the early farming sites. You see this boom of activity, and then it kind of shoots up the peninsula. So you really get that sort of sense of a demographic transition. And by about 5,500 BC, the Neolithic way of life was established across the entire region. And it really is this watershed moment, or at least I think it is. I think the notion of the Neolithic being a real watershed moment has been watered down for quite a while, at least with sort of post-processual archaeology and certain movements in terms of thinking about how profound this transition was or not. This is kind of something I want to really explore a bit more in this lecture, so we'll kind of get into that and why I think it is a real true watershed moment in the history of our species. And also what I've been kind of doing is I've been showing you basically lots of dots and squiggly lines on a screen, but really this is something that involves people and it's about people. And that's really what I'll be talking about today. Unfortunately, because I am a bioarchaeologist and because I deal with sort of archaeological science and things like that, I'm afraid I will be showing you more dots and squiggly lines, but trying to kind of understand the people and how people have, or how previous scholars have tried to sort of think about this. I mean, the human bioarchaeology of the transition to agriculture has a pretty long history of study with these kinds of classic studies here. I mean, this is probably the most famous, but also a more recent offering by Ron Pinhasi and Jay Stock. These are basically studies that tried to analyze human skeletons and tried to sort of look at the impact of this process on the human body from, again, a more traditional bioarchaeological approach. I've become kind of more interested in what I guess I think of as fresher approaches based on kind of a human or at least an evolutionary approach, and using what's termed a life history approach. So really trying to kind of look underneath and look at the kind of complex relationship between all these biological processes and trying to really understand human adaptation during this time. One really interesting book I came across, in which, again, as I was teaching this stuff in recent months, I learned on quite a lot, was this book by Steve Shannon, First Forms of Europe, an Evolutionary Perspective. And again, this really takes this kind of combined and integrated approach, trying to draw on different kinds of data to really come to a rounded and integrated understanding of early farmers in Europe. Kind of leaning more on the human and the kind of bioarchaeological side was a recent paper by Jonathan Wells and Jay Stock, which again tried to really look at, again, what's happening at a sort of deeper biological level with the transition to agriculture. And they developed this very interesting little model here, which I'll talk about. But one thing about a lot of these studies is that Southern Europe has been largely excluded. It's not a part of the world where there has been a lot of intensive application of archaeological science for a very long time. That's changed now, but for a long time, there just simply wasn't the data. So again, in this wonderful book by Stephen Shannon, he can really get a good handle on what's happening in the UK, in Ireland, in Central Europe. But the sections on the south of Europe just don't really have data because there hasn't been that kind of intensive scientific work for a very long time. So it's something as well, which I kind of, with this work that I'm doing, I kind of want to try to change that and to add to some of these, to sort of add to these interesting possibilities that are happening elsewhere in Europe. So I just wanted to kind of home in on this image here. And this is a figure from, again, this Wells and Stock paper, which tries to understand these kind of underlying biological processes that are happening with agriculture. And this basically relies on the principle that energy is limited. The energy that we put into our bodies through food is limited. And basically there's a competition between the allocation of energy towards things like growth, so growth in the body, towards reproduction, towards defense against pathogens, diseases, and then towards actually just normal maintaining of the body. So there's a kind of complex relationship going on with these things. So basically, energy can be reallocated away from one of these functions to another function. And this is really, really interesting. And it makes, again, this sort of notion of the biological implications, the biological trajectory that happened following the transition to agriculture. It makes it quite, again, it just kind of adds that extra layer of depth to sort of some of the previous research that's been done. So to try and kind of begin to get at this, I started thinking about, well, what data do we have access to? What data do I have access to that allows us to begin to play around with some of these ideas? As I mentioned, this is built on my PhD work. So my doctoral work was looking at estimated body size and also trying to reconstruct physical activity and habitual behavior in Italian prehistory. So I was looking at, again, estimations of body size and examining the morphology of the limb bones of prehistoric individuals and looking at the morphology to try and reconstruct habitual behavior. Towards the end of my PhD, I got quite interested, and I had the good fortune to be able to work with some interesting people on the Fraxis project who were looking at some different approaches. So big data modeling of radiocarbon dates to try to reconstruct population dynamics, so basically population fluctuations, how that changes over time. And then also people who are looking at trying to reconstruct diet through stable isotopes. So I started then also having these wonderful conversations with people about how we can merge these things all together. So I want to talk just a little bit about the actual material which I used to do some of this work. So I looked up individuals for the Neolithic and the Copper Age in the central Mediterranean, and then I drew unpublished data from the Upper Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, the Bronze Age, the Roman and the medieval and the modern period. So really about 24,000 years of human history expressed here. To try to understand the diet, I then went into the literature and I gathered together stable isotope data for 1,787 human individuals and about 600 animals. So just kind of going through all the reports and compiling a nice database. And then also during the sort of last few years, or really over the last sort of 5 years, and as alongside a colleague, Rowan McLaughlin, basically gathering radiocarbon data from this region as well. And this is something which we published just last year, a big sort of analysis of this data where we looked at 4,500 radiocarbon dates, again, to try to reconstruct population dynamics over time. So again, this is the kind of crux of what I'll be talking about. So because I've talked a bit about this already, I think it's probably right to start with this. And this is a, again, so it hasn't actually, I'm afraid that the proper diagram hasn't actually come out, but that's fine, you get the picture. This basically shows the density of radiocarbon dates over time within the central Mediterranean within the central Mediterranean region. What we can see, and again, this is a kind of a popular approach which has been used as a proxy for reconstructing population size. And of course, there are lots of debates either way about this, but I think whenever we begin to look at this, we see something kind of quite cool. So we see this kind of this signal of a low population density in the pre-agricultural period, coming in at around about 6,100 BC. We then see this sort of spike, a signal of a population boom with the Neolithic. And again, this is something that we see all over Europe with sort of the sort of very first signal of agriculture. And again, this sort of, again, tells us we have this large, booming, fertile population. There's very interesting work looking at, again, skeletal data, which supports this, but also, again, genetic work, which again shows that there is this huge population boom with the transition to agriculture. But what's really interesting is that after that, things are never really the same again. And whilst we do have, this fluctuating pattern, there is, sustained population thereafter. So with agriculture, our global population never really ever changes. And indeed, we just hit 8 billion people on this planet about 2 weeks ago. That all goes back to this moment in time. So again, it's really thinking about this being the kind of beginning of all of that. I want to talk now about results from the work on body size, which I did. And again, if you look around this room, you have tall people, you have small people. That's just a normal, that's just a part of normal population variation. But our body size is very interesting because it is something that can be influenced by both genetic and non-genetic factors. Okay, so again, we can inherit how tall that we are from our parents, but also your ability to reach your full height potential is something which can be disturbed by episodes such as childhood malnutrition or any kind of developmental stress. So by actually then looking at skeletal estimations of this over time, we can begin to get a hold on patterns on, again, skeletal growth, development, and health over time. And we can do this. But first of all, actually, I'll just talk a little bit more. Yes, we can do this through 2 ways, okay? We can estimate body mass by taking a simple measurement of the basically hip. And we can estimate stature by looking at the maximum length of the femur, so the thigh bone. 2 very, very simple measurements that we can use to do this. And then we can use these equations. Again, there are many, many equations out there, but I've used ones by Ruff and colleagues from 2012 developed for European Holocene populations. But I just want to kind of quickly talk about this sort of genetic contribution to stature. And again, that is something, again, as I said, we do inherit things like stature from our parents, basically. And this is a little, this graph here shows, excuse me. This graph shows, again, basically changes in what the authors have called genomic height over time across the transition to agriculture. And what we see here is that this actually shows that, basically predicted height from a genetic perspective actually declines. Okay, so we have these hunter-gatherers with quite high estimations of height, then a drop with the Neolithic, and then an uptick then in the post-agricultural period. So this is really interesting. It does show that there is definitely something going on here. But again, I really stress the fact that we do have a really good handle and a good understanding of, again, these processes of development and growth, and again, episodes of childhood malnutrition and your environment having a really strong impact on, again, patterns of adult height. So that allows us to have really powerful insights, into these episodes of developmental stress when this might be, occurring a bit more, And it's especially informative when looked over the long term. So here what we have, some charts. This is body mass from the upper Paleolithic. So basically an estimation of body mass expressed in kilograms and an estimate in stature, so height expressed in centimeters. And what we see is coming into the Neolithic period, so into the transition to agriculture, there's a really pronounced decline in body mass and in stature, okay? And then after that, there is a recovery amongst established farming groups. It's very interesting that we should also see a second little decline occurring during the Roman period. So again, it seems to sort of point at, do we see these increased moments of physiological stress and growth impairment during these times of crucial and quite significant social and economic change. So it's quite interesting that we should see that. It's worth noting as well that this trend of declining body size with the transition to agriculture is something that we kind of see almost on a global scale. It's something which is seen in large parts of Europe, and a really interesting paper here by Mummert et al. In 2011, again, approached this from a global perspective. So it is that kind of classic trend. This again is slightly more complicated chart where we can see basically the difference between men and women. And there's something kind of very interesting even happens here. You see that there's this, again, we see this very sharp decline coming in to the Neolithic, okay? But what we do see is that whilst we see that stature amongst males over time is quite volatile. We see that actually amongst women, so in the red here, it's a lot less, basically it fluctuates a lot less over time. And that's really, really interesting because then we begin to sort of think about different physiological responses to stress between men and women. We know that basically women are more buffered against episodes of physiological stress. So again, we can kind of see that happening over this kind of 24,000-year story. So just a kind of interesting little pattern that we can see. I want to now move on to talk about trying to reconstruct physical activity and habitual behavior. And this again was, I was saying in one of the earlier slides that I was looking at the morphology of the limb bones and looking at them in cross section, and then basically using that as a way of excuse me, basically by looking at the morphology of the limb bones and applying some kind of formulae to basically understand how mechanically competent that the bones are, basically to understand adaptations to physical behavior. So it's a way of basically trying to reconstruct physical behavior. And what we can see here is that, again, with coming into the Neolithic, we see this kind of big uptake, this kind of big increase in basically the robusticity of the upper limb of the humerus. So that's really, really interesting. We also see then a decrease in the metal ages, and then also a slight increase in the Roman period as well. So we kind of begin again to see this kind of continuing picture that interesting things are happening during the Neolithic. It gets even more interesting whenever we can compare differences in the left and right upper limb and look at patterns of asymmetry. And what we generally see is greater asymmetry in upper limb strength among men and less so among women. So you can see here that basically there is more kind of strength on one side amongst men, whereas women tend to have kind of equal strength on both sides. And that has been seen in other parts of Europe and in other parts of the world. And it's generally been interpreted as perhaps males being involved in extra domestic agricultural tasks. So again, tasks which involve a lot of sort of working with one hand versus perhaps women being involved in things such as bimanual food processing. So using querns for grinding grain and things like that. those are some of the interpretations that have been put forth. It's really up to you whether you can really interpret this data in any way that you want. But the most crucial thing about this is that it actually shows that there is a whole new regime of activity and behaviors that come with agriculture. And if we think about that early slide about, again, how these things, again, the importance of these things, and again, thinking about energy expenditure, so what you're actually eating, and then how that energy is dealt with and how it is allocated once it's in your body. Again, we begin to sort of, again, see really interesting things happening with the Neolithic. Again, this hasn't worked because we should have error bars here, but never mind. So one other way that we can sort of, one other area which I looked at was looking at diet and stable isotopes, and this should again show a nice summary of that data with error bars, but it's really just a kind of again, it's not that important. The really kind of interesting stuff is whenever we look at nitrogen 15, we basically see a progressive decrease in nitrogen enrichment leading into the Neolithic. So we see this kind of from the upper Paleolithic into the Mesolithic into the Neolithic, and then an uptick again in the Copper Age. This is a very different story to what we see in other parts of Europe, where you actually see quite a sharp decline in nitrogen levels. So in places like Northern Europe, where hunter-gatherer, pre-agricultural populations are eating a lot of fish, they're relying on quite a lot of marine resources, you again see usually quite a sharp decrease in nitrogen 15 coming into the Neolithic. That's not the case in the Mediterranean because pre-agricultural groups there don't eat a lot of fish. So they're actually kind of eating these terrestrial resources, and therefore you don't get a really profound signal. Now, this pattern is quite multifactorial. Let's say it can be influenced by a number of different factors. So could it be a signal of decreased consumption of protein over time? Could it be a signal of landscape degradation? So there are fewer nutrients in the soil. That's what can sometimes lead to this signal of basically decreased nitrogen enrichment. Again, one thing which I have to do as a sort of next step, I was hoped to have it done by this talk, but I didn't get around to it, was again the actual inclusion of the animal, of the stable isotopes for the animals, basically as a baseline, as a formal baseline. So you have to have the animals, basically what they're eating, so that you can kind of fully understand the human signal. So that's kind of the next step, but this is again very much a work in progress to sort of show at least what's happening with the human data. So what I've been doing so far is I've kind of talked about things in this kind of regional scale, and that's all very well and good, and I think it kind of does lead to some quite interesting patterns, especially if you want to think and try to get try to approach these kind of broader questions on a sort of evolutionary scale. But I want to talk about some work again which I was involved in, which again tried to look at a single site and a few individuals. So this is a paper that was published 2 years ago in Journal of Archaeological Science reports looking at 2 female individuals from a ditched village on the Tavo area. Now, this is this huge big coastal plain in the south of Italy. So here's your sort of boot and the heel of Italy. It's this huge big coastal plain, which during the early Neolithic saw huge settlement density. It's the densest area of settlement in all of Neolithic Europe, where you get all of these sort of ditched, enclosed villages popping up, and then often within these ditches where people were buried. So here is again plans of this. You see this cross section of a ditch here, these 2 individuals in there. And what's really amazing, so this is work which again was funded by the Prehistoric Society, where I got a bit of funding to get a couple of radiocarbon dates. I want to show that whenever we modeled all of the radiocarbon dates together, so thinking a couple of slides back, whenever we were trying to model these, look at these trends and understand or get towards an understanding of population size, we see this signal of, again, the apex here, okay? So this idea that we have population growth, the apex of the population, and then eventual population decline. These individuals sit right slap bang. This is the sort of date range of the two individuals. They sit slap bang at this moment of apex, okay? And that's really, really exciting because you kind of begin to build a picture of these two people sort of living at the sort of height of the Neolithic in this part of the world, in the area of the most densest Neolithic settlement in all of Europe. So what we also looked at again was the stable isotope data. And again, what we saw generally was that the individuals from the site Fonte Viva had slightly more nitrogen enriched values than most other Neolithic individuals from the same region, apart from this cluster of individuals from a nearby site called Passo di Corvo. And this is a really interesting site. It's one of these absolutely huge dished burials where, again, all the human remains have this quite high nitrogen signal. It was interpreted by the people who did this work originally as, again, perhaps a signal of manuring or something like that, which again can lead to these kind of elevated nitrogen signals. But it's quite interesting that these individuals from Fonte Viva kind of are up towards the sort of higher end. We were kind of frustrated when doing this work because there was a complete lack of directly dated burials, because we were sort of looking at things and a kind of lumping all of these Neolithic individuals together. But if we're able to maybe look at these things on a continuous time scale informed by radiocarbon data, we'd actually be able to maybe kind of not have to rely on these broad timeframes and be able to actually look at things again on a continuous absolute time scale. So really kind of what I'm trying to say is that there's probably something interesting going on because these individuals are probably a bit later in time. They'd probably date to around about there. These individuals there, and some of these individuals, again, not on the basis of relative chronology, probably date to the earlier part. So this kind of signal that there might be this sort of, progressive increase in nitrogen over the course of the Neolithic. So kind of going back to, again, this signal here where that we're looking at this by just sort of looking at blocks of time. But if we were able to strip that away and look at things on a continuous time scale, we'd probably reveal a lot more subtle and very interesting trends. So to kind of go back to trying to sum this all up, and with the great simplification, or what I've termed the gross oversimplification, and kind of a nod back to this model here. What's really interesting whenever we look at the evidence of reconstructing physical activity, you can see that again there is this real marked shift in activity regimes coming in from the Neolithic onwards. And we had to sort of think about what the implications this might be for increased energetic expenditure versus diet. So the amount of food that you're taking in versus the kind of labor-intensive activities that you might be engaging in. We also, again, this interesting signal of, again, noticeably less nitrogen-enriched diets, or at least less nitrogen-enriched signal during the Neolithic is really, really interesting. But again, there's kind of a bit more to be probed in there, and I need to do a little bit more work there. I think for me, one of the interesting things as well is looking at this kind of matched signal of smaller body size during the Neolithic. And again, is it a case that we're seeing this sort of so these marked changes in skeletal growth, increase in developmental stress, the redirection of energy away from, again, things like growth towards things like reproduction. Again, we're seeing, this huge population booms. We know that these are sort of very fertile populations that we're dealing with. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it is a work in progress, and it's kind of trying to sort of think about how all of these different things are interconnected. And that's really been, or that is really the challenge as I write these things up, to try to sort of piece this together and to weave it all together. But to kind of conclude, what I've been trying to get at here is understanding the interrelation between population dynamics, human behavior, the sort of levels of human behavior, health, and diet. And I think sort of what has continually come up in the data is that, again, this notion of Neolithic being this truly watershed moment in the history of our species is something which I think is sort of known in quite a lot of ways, but also I kind of really the kind of true biological implications, which is what I'm interested in, kind of true biological implications of that haven't really been explored that much. Ultimately, proxies are proxies. So all of the data that I've been talking about, we're using, for example, radiocarbon data to try to reconstruct population there. That has its limitations. Using stable isotopes to understand data, that has its understand diet, that has its limitations. Proxies are proxies, but it's what we have whenever we're dealing with archaeology. So really what I've tried to do is just bring together the data and see what it starts to tell us. And really, in terms of bringing this forward, what I want to, as I said, what I wanted to do was try to sort of move towards looking at this stuff on a continuous timescale. So stepping away from these cultural labels, not just analyzing things in terms of blocks of, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, but being able to step away from that and look at all of this on a kind of continuous timescale, but also towards developing a truly integrated data set. So that is to say, where we have this different kinds of information for one individual, because I've pieced a lot of this together from just what we have published out there. And sometimes you can actually find a case that where I have the skeletal data for one individual, I might have the radiocarbon date for them, but I might not have the dietary isotopes or vice versa. It's really, really hard to try to sort of piece this together, but it would be amazing if we just could have all of these different strands of info for single individuals. But at the moment, it's just not possible with what we have. And that's why I guess in the next couple of months, I'm going to be really trying to develop this further by having focused study on specific regions. So working probably towards the south of Italy, going back and examining some of these sites where we have burials, and basically attacking them from every single angle, dating, the analysis of the skeleton, the isotopes, and some other approaches to really kind of to build up kind of biographies of single individuals. So that's kind of really, as I say, a work in progress. It's where I want to take this work. And I'll just say thank you very much for listening, and any questions, please go for it.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone. Now, I don't know if we have any questions coming up there. Are there any questions from the floor here to start off with? Yes. I'd like to ask you what your views are on historical continuity from the period you're talking about. As far as farming is concerned, farming lifestyles. And I'm asking for two reasons. Basically, one is I'm working on the legacy of my old teacher, SNM, who was into some of this stuff without having access to all of the information. Right. And basically, he was very keen on the Mediterranean route as far as Ireland is concerned. And I think one of your maps sort of supports that in terms of Mediterranean connections to this island. And more particularly in 1939, discovered Rondale in West Donegal.
When Evans discovered Rondale alive and well and working, well, not very well, but working in Northwest Donegal, he explicitly stated that communal farming was of great antiquity in Southern Europe. Which is your
Okay.
yeah. And he also thought that the Mediterranean route was basically had created a sort of cultural region from the Iberian Peninsula up to northern Norway, all the peninsulas and islands and so on. Not so much southern England, but most of Britain and all of Ireland, etc. So that's my first reason I'm asking about this continuity. Okay. Second is that colleagues at Maynooth, Eamon Slater and Owen Flaherty, I don't know if you know them. They're in sociology in Maynooth. They're not in geography. They're not in archaeology. They're in sociology. And they see communal farming as basically a vestige of primitive communism, of the period after the domestication of plants and animals. Obviously, it's farming, but before states and classes, etc., have developed. So communal, and the Rundale system that Evans discovered was communal, which just gets back to this business of the antiquity of communality, which I suspect is what is the main defensible position of, what is it that's continuing? Well, I don't necessarily think it's Rundale, but it might have been communal.
Well, so I have thought about aspects of this over the years in different ways, and again through kind of conversations I've had with people. I mean, the thing about agriculture and early agriculture is that it kind of is the origins of inequality in some ways. Basically, people begin to produce stuff, and then some people have a bit more than the others, and it really is kind of the origins of inequality in many ways. But there are kind of other kind of areas where I think that communal farming, or that kind of communal system, or with a kind of it really is the case. And one of the other areas where I've been lucky to work is the Maltese Islands. I talked a bit about it at the front during the first part of the lecture. And it's really interesting because there you have a system which again, it really does appear to be a kind of communal system. I mean, you have tiny little islands where they're building these megalithic structures. Again, this is Neolithic, a bit later in time than what I was talking about, but again, you're talking about Neolithic farming societies. They build these big megalithic monuments, which aren't for burying the dead. They really seem to be about basically getting people together and having a bit of a party and kind of eating lots of food and sharing resources. You also have people, again, whenever they're buried in the afterlife, they're buried in these huge communal tombs. Okay, you don't have any evidence of interpersonal violence. You find very little weapons. You find very little evidence of basically any violence on the bones. It really seems like a pretty peaceful place where, again, it seems like a communal farming system on this island, this kind of tiny island chain in the middle of the Mediterranean, where again, that's just the kind of system that seems to be it. It doesn't, there's no inequality at play there. It really does seem to be a kind of communal system. So I mean, that's kind of the only way I can or the first thing that comes to mind, you're kind of asking about it. So that's just more kind of a blurb back to your question. Yeah. Any other sort of okay, super. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are some questions coming in here. What did you mean women are buffered against physiological stress?
Is this the sorry, can you repeat that? Sorry.
What did you mean women are buffered against physiological stress?
So what I meant by that was that there's quite a few studies where basically the physiology of women, so their biology, how they're built, basically, they're basically more buffered towards episodes of stress. So basically, and that is basically to do with the fact that female bodies are just more resilient. To put it simply, they have to deal with a lot more stresses and strains than what the male body does, and that kind of carries through on a biological sort of level, which is why, again, even looking at things, patterns in body size over time is where we kind of see those, why that we might, it's one interpretation why we might see those kind of quite pronounced peaks and trough in the sort of body size in males over time, whereas we don't see it so much in women. So there's been just a little bit of sort of work on that I'm drawing on. So yeah.
Any questions from the floor?
Thanks, Barry. I just wanted to ask a question about, again, going back to, it's very interesting, your data, showing body size.
Thank you.
During the Neolithic period. And, your first thoughts would be, well, farming's come in and people are better fed. So, you'd expect body size maybe to increase. But that you found quite the opposite. I was wondering, can you rule out genetic effects here? Like a specific population coming in?
So this is
certain genetic characteristics?
So, I mean, that's totally right. And I will try to see if I can shoot back up to, excuse me. I tried to touch upon that a little bit because, let's see here. So there, again, this, let me see. I will find it eventually. This one here, okay. So this is, again, this is, I didn't spend too much time talking about this because I didn't really have a sense of how much time that I might have, but so this here shows, as I was mentioning, time along the bottom, and then we basically have estimations of what they term genomic height, so basically genetic estimations of height. And you can see that in this group here, the green group, these are the Neolithic individuals. This is a sample from Iberia, okay, so from Spain and Portugal. And what's really interesting is that you do see this kind of decreased, signal of genomic height. Okay, so exactly what you're saying, totally true. Okay, so that's what this paper was really about. There's been some other work by people, but one person in particular called Samantha Cox over in Pennsylvania, and some other colleagues, where they've tried to sort of dig into this a bit more, comparing sort of the DNA with skeletons, so having the individuals where that you have both bits of info. And basically, the upshot of that research is that, yes, there is a genetic component, but again, these kind of other things going on, these other non-genetic environmental things, are very real, and these can. So, for example, you might have genetic height potential, the potential to reach a certain height that's inherited. But if your growth gets disturbed in childhood, you're not going to reach that potential because because your growth has been disturbed. So, and it is clear from this some interesting work where basically people are for the first time trying to kind of look at the genetic story as well as sort of what we call the phenotypic story. So kind of what you can see in the body, the observable traits, trying to bring that together. Kind of hard to really pick apart at the moment, but I think we can kind of confidently kind of talk about some of these trends because, there's been a lot of other work elsewhere where, again, we can sort of look at socioeconomic status and things like that and really see that, you can see differences in somebody's socioeconomic status and their body size. There's quite a lot of work out there on that. To also go back to your first part about sort of that one would think that agricultural diets are very good and there is something good about an agricultural diet. That's why we all do it now. But that crucial thing of hunter-gatherer diets, are quite diverse. You can go out into the land and obviously with great difficulty and require great skill. go out and get a lovely diverse diet. With agriculture and with early agriculture, we as a species decided to put all of our eggs in one basket, and we rely on a very restricted collection of domesticated plants and domesticated animals, and that does just have nutritional implications. So actually, you do see it a lot that kind of, early agricultural societies do suffer from kind of poor health versus pre-agricultural groups. So it is one of those interesting kind of paradoxes of early agriculture. So, yeah.
Can I give you another question?
Sure.
Here? Apart from manuring, is there any chance that the soil itself could have had high nitrogen content that would have affected the nitrogen readings?
So what I will say is I don't know. I mean, it's that I'll admit that part of the work I'm still kind of needing to have a bit of a think about, but again, and chat to a few people who are a lot more qualified than me to interpret those results. So yeah, but it's a good point.
Any questions from more questions? There's some more questions online. Or another one here. When you compared the picture offered by the Mediterranean nitrogen data compared to that for Northern Europe, does the latter include Ireland, or is that a different kettle of fish yet again? Pardon the pun.
So let's see, I can get this bit here. So this bit here. So if I understood the question right, it's sort of asking whether this includes data from Ireland. And no, sorry, this is just the data from the central Mediterranean area, which I collected. This point here was to sort of say that it's interesting that we see a completely different story to what we see in Northern Europe. So kind of that really interesting work that was done by Rick Shelting some time ago, which again sort of showed this classic signal of a real drop in of a real drop in nitrogen signals coming into the Neolithic. That's not what we see in the Mediterranean region. That's because kind of Mediterranean pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers, they're not eating a lot of fish. The Mediterranean Sea has a very low yield compared to, again, parts of the Atlantic coast, where again you do get even some parts of North Europe, especially in the Baltic area, where you get these quite substantial hunter-gatherer groups developing there because they just have, they have a stable aquatic resource. You don't get that in the Mediterranean region. So that's the kind of what I was kind of trying to highlight there. Perhaps it was a bit confusing, is that we see a very different story to Northern Europe. It's a very kind of progressive. Well, I'm kind of talking, sorry, she's just added in with a new, Linda has just added in here. So is basically whenever I say Northern Europe, does that include Ireland? Well, yes, I mean, I'm talking about generally the Northern European Atlantic coast. So yeah, but I don't know the Irish picture that well. So.
Any further questions? Okay.
A non-scientific question, but what was the doodle on your first slide?
No, that is a great question. So this is a wonderful little, this here. Mm-hmm. So this is, I mean, I kind of chose it. It's often a little bit, whenever somebody asks you for an image, or if you need to put an image so that there isn't just a sort of white blank patch, I like to have something on my slide. So I like to choose this. This is basically a cave painting from a site called Porto Badisco in the south of Italy. And it just shows a little squiggly human figurine. It's on there for no other reason than I think it's very nice, and it suits, and it basically comes from that time period. It's basically, I just like it because basically it shows a sort of human-like figure, but it's a cultural expression of a human-like figure. I think that's just a very wonderful thing because I'm talking about people here, and I'm talking about the bioarchaeological aspect primarily, but also culture is a huge aspect as well. So it's kind of just there as a sort of, basically I'm talking about Neolithic people of the region. This is how maybe Neolithic people might have viewed themselves. So it's really just there as a sort of nice looking thing.
Any further questions? Well, Owen, can I thank you very much indeed for your lecture? It's been
Thank you.
fascinating
Thank you.
bringing this sort of data together.
Oh,
And
I
I
mean,
think it was the sort of data that we don't necessarily see all that often. And you've explained it actually extremely well.
well, I'm not too sure about that, but as I say, it's a work in progress. So yeah, we're getting there. So yeah. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Steve. Can we thank? Thank you very much, Steve, for coming.
Thanks.
One thing I'm